So we have learned, question one, we've learned before that muscles contract. Bless you. That muscles contract and actively shorten. That is their one main activity they do all day long if required. How does the body use this quality? Choose all that apply. And I think this is where I messed up a little, right? So what do we do with that?
Maintain posture.
You maintain posture, right?
Right. Generate heat.
You generate heat. So if you have cold and you have to make yourself warmer, you do jumping jacks. That'll get you warmer. That's generate heat. Support soft tissue. Yeah. Like the stomach wall holds the gut in. That's a support. Regulate movement in. Yes, you can eat because you have muscle. We need muscle to close the jaw. The tongue in itself is a muscle that moves to move stuff around. And it can move us around.
It was all of them. Okay.
Huh?
It was all of them.
It was all of them.
But then I got wrong for that. When I choose all of
Yeah,
them.
I think that's the question that I made a mistake. People texted me, but then I try to fix it. But I have to do it afterwards because it's multiple choice versus multiple answers. So I couldn't do it after the fact. For some reason, oh well. And so that's all here, right?
Yep.
Basically. When we look at how a muscle is built and consider what its qualities are, we mentioned the fact that it contracts. It also needs to be able to receive information telling it when to contract. The brain mostly controls our skeletal muscles, the ones that make us move around. Can you list other muscle characteristics? Elasticity, excitability, and extensibility. We better don't have too much of that, too much of that. They break. We don't want to break. You guys got that one. Reading anatomy language is often confusing and difficult. It's like a foreign language. That is because a lot of the words used are constructed from Greek or Latin pre and suffixes. That's why I'm pointing these out as much as I can. What means what. If you learn those, you will be able to understand the language much better. Name the three prefixes that describe muscles. There you go. Good. That wasn't too difficult. Most of the time we think of muscles, we mean the ones that move us around in the world. We also have other ones that we don't think too much about it, but are equally important. Can you list the three types of muscles?
Smooth, skeletal, and cardiac.
There you go. Good. Smooth, skeletal, and cardiac. Respiration happens because of skeletal muscle, actually. So that's a brain question, how we activate those muscles. And then intestine stuff happens because we have smooth muscle. So when we hear our stomach growling, it's smooth muscle that growls. And other stuff that goes around in there, the liquidy stuff. A muscle mainly needs to contract in order to know when to do that, and nerve communicates with it. Muscles have three main specific organelles that make a contraction possible. First, the cell membrane is very specialized in that it becomes stimulated by a nerve and carry an impulse deep into the muscle via tubular extensions. What is the cell membrane in a muscle called? Sarcolemma. There you go. Sarcolemma. It's terminology. Let's look at a picture though for that, huh? Let's see if you got some visuals. These are the slides. When you look under a microscope, how they look. When you do like a Bio 2 class, we just talked about that, like a higher level anatomy class, you take these booklets and that's your starting point. And then you build from there with whatever book you gotta get. Because the book they used to have originally for this class was basically the Bio 20AB class book, but in a shortened version. And it was like, I didn't like it. It was not leaving all the good stuff in because You can't just teach it superficially because it's not that difficult to understand. The big difficulty about anatomy is it's so much like how a muscle works. Once you understand how a muscle works, you understand how a muscle works. And we can start learning the muscle names and what they do. But because we have 4 layers of muscles in a hand and a foot, and it's so many of them, that's where it gets really difficult. And so, anyway, so you look, and so, where was I? Oh, I was in the sarcolemma. So this is the microscopic anatomy of all the 3 muscles. And then when we take it apart a little bit, we look at now the specific organelles. And the first one we do is the sarcolemma, and that's the cell membrane. You know, that's wraps around the cell membrane. And on the inside of the cell, we then have these small organelles called the myofibrils. But let me not get ahead of it, because that's probably coming up right here. Where is it? Secondly, our muscles have long, thread-like organelles that do the actual physical contraction. They lay parallel to one another and span the entire muscle length. What are those specialized organelles called?
You just said it.
Myofibrils. So mitochondria, we have, what do mitochondria do? Remember?
No.
Don't remember? They make the
Oh,
energy.
the ATP.
We have a lot of those in there too. And what else? Sarcoplasmic reticulum, we kind of come to that as well. And sarcolemma we just talked about. So the myofibrils are filled with 2 kinds of parallel arranged protein threads. When a muscle contracts, one of them grabs the other one and pulls on it. Do you get that? One of them grabs on it and pulls on it. Let me find you a picture of that. See here. This head here, this head here is on one of the threads. And it can grab on to this other thread. That's the other thread. All right? And so basically, what happens when a muscle contracts is that head, or that mouth, or whatever we call it, grabs on to that thread and yanks on it and lets go. And slowly the muscle will get shorter. That's basically a muscle contraction, right there. What are those threads called? Myosin and actin. The pulling action requires a lot of energy. That's from ATP molecules. So the energy, whenever we think energy, we think ATP. That's why when you lose a lot of energy, you're going to have a lot of ATP used. You have a lot of mitochondria that make a lot of the ATP, that make all the ATP, pretty much. The fact that one can grab the other one has to do with the presence of calcium. The third very important muscle organelle is a bag-like structure similar to the endoplasmic reticulum. Remember that from the cell chapter? ER? So when we make the fats, we make the proteins, the baggy thing that comes off the nucleus. And now we have one that is similar, it's a bag, but it doesn't make anything. It basically stores calcium ions. What is that one called? Good. Instead of endoplasmic reticulum, it's sarcoplasmic reticulum. Good. So now we have a myofibril here. That's that round thing that's red here. That's the length of it. Or actually here it's exposed. And inside there, you see these bigger dots and the smaller dots. You have these redder lines in the middle, those are the myosin. And you have these bluer lines towards the outside where there's a zigzag line here, which is an anchor basically, for the next segment. And those are the actins. So these are the myosins and those are the actins. The myosin's got these heads on it, and so they're going to grab onto these heads and they're going to yank on this actin and pull it closer. So basically we do that from both sides, and slowly these ends go closer into on one another, and that shortens this whole section, which when you make that into a big muscle that's long, that will shorten the whole muscle. So you have all these segments, along a whole muscle, segment, and they all shorten a little bit, but in their world, they shorten by half. Or not by half, probably, right? But they shorten quite a bit. And so the whole muscle will shorten as a thing because you have all these segments one after the other. And on these models, here, these are these lines with from here to here is one of those segments. So that's on the model. So you have the model on the table to see it three-dimensionally. That might help. So that's the myofibril. And then we got the endoplasmic, the endoplasmic reticulum, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, sorry about that, is right here. That's the blue stuff right here. You see how that's sort of bag-like? And that's around all these myofibrils. And it stores calcium. And when a muscle contracts, it can only contract when calcium is present. And the reason for that is when we have these myosin heads, these long threads with the head on it that attach to the actin, to the other thread, to pull on it. When there is no actin, no calcium present, they cannot do that. They're inhibited from doing that. They're inhibited by something that covers what we call an active site, which is sort of a magnet place. You can think of a magnet where the head of the myosin attaches to the actin, and if that magnet is covered, it's really a thread that covers it. When there's no calcium present, then it cannot attach to one another. So that's why we need the calcium, and that's why every myofibril has these bags around it, so the calcium is right there. And so if a muscle needs to contract, we can let the calcium into the myofibril, it can free up those magnets, and the action can happen. Because the ATP is already present, that energy that we need, that's already present. And so the muscle contraction, therefore, doesn't mean, oh, you need to step on the gas because you need to pump the ATP in so finally the machinery can work up. No, the machinery is ready to go. And all you need to do is pull the plug so the machinery can run its course, because all we need is to free up that magnet. And that's done by the calcium. So that's why the calcium is so important. So we have a whole organelle that's just devoted in a muscle. It's very interesting. It's a very specialized cell. All it needs to do is contract. So you have all these organelles that are very specialized. So that's why we have the ER can become the SR, because we don't need to make all this stuff all the time. We just need to use it. Well, we need to repair stuff, but yeah. All right, let's go. Does that make sense? Good. Was that this question? Yeah. Look at that, moving right along, huh? Now, during a muscle contraction, a nerve impulse stimulates the cell membrane, which sends a message to contract deep into the muscle fiber. It activates the third organelle, releasing the calcium, which is the SR, which then makes the pulling thread be able to grab one another. That's freeing up that magnet. That thicker thread has a kind of a head, we call it the head. On it on one side, it bends back and forth. It's what grabs the thinner thread, which is the actin, pulling on the thread. The ATP molecule gives it the energy to pull. It also makes it able to detach from the thinner thread and then grab again and pull some more. A little complicated, but kind of cool, right? You got that though? It's this grabbing mechanism. We just have to describe all the points of doing it. And that's basically how it contracts. And we call that cycle what? Sliding filaments, because the actin and the myosins are two filaments. These threads are also called filaments. Good. And that's basically the chapter. Have a good day. But that's the most, that's the stuff that drives people nuts, is this part. That's the physiology of muscle contraction. And of course, there's always more to it, but we start with this. I like to start with this level. because it's good enough for what we need it for clinically, for the most part. And then I think, let's see, well, let's go through the cycle real quick. That's described here. You got that picture? Good. Muscle cells contract, and when we say muscle cells, we mean a muscle fiber. And a muscle fiber, I should maybe mention that a muscle fiber spans the entire length of a muscle. So if a muscle goes from here to here, the whole length is one fiber, is one thread. And inside that one thread, we have all these little myofibrils. Those are the smaller threads that then have these little threads that act in the myosin inside of them. So it's all this layer stuff. So I guess all that small. So they contract when a nerve sends an impulse to them when stimulated. When stimulated, they contract as strongly as they can. The strength of a muscle contraction is determined by how many of the small thread-like muscle cells are stimulated at one time. Nerves connect to varied amounts of muscle fibers and activate them all at once when a nerve fires. What do we call a nerve and all the muscle cells that innervate it? Motor unit. Does that make sense? So if we have a muscle in the face that just needs to lift this corner up, I know it's a heavy corner, but still just needs to lift this corner up of gravity. It's a small muscle, and you have multiple nerve fibers that go into it, so we can do smiles, big smile or little smile. So it doesn't always, because then we can vary the strength of the contraction if we have multiple gradations, because one nerve that fires, all the fibers that it innervates will fire. Down in here, in a quad, the muscle fibers themselves are pretty much the same thickness. I mean, a little bit variation, but here we need to kick a foot up and kick a ball or something, and really activate a lot of strength and force. We don't need to be so fine-tuned. So in there, we gotta have more muscle fibers innervated by one nerve, and that one nerve stimulates, gives a bigger force that it puts onto the muscle, and we have a bigger force that we can let go. We have not as much gradation. It's very hard to play with that muscle and fine-tune it than with a facial muscle. It's very much considerably harder. So that's what a motor unit is. Let me push this up here. I should have done this actually. There it was. That's the picture. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that's a picture of the actin thread, and that black dot, that's what they call the active side, that's the magnet. And that thread is over that magnet when there's no calcium present. And when there's calcium present, right here, the red dots are the calcium, and that's a cross view, then that thread moves away and the black side here becomes free and the magnet is empty to be attached. Freed up. So that's pretty cool. I think that's pretty cool. And then there was no question on this red thing here. And when we look at the sarcolemma, which is the wrapper, the cell membrane around the whole cell, when you look at the nerve impulse, it comes down and it goes through the whole sarcolemma and spreads through the whole sarcolemma because it's electrically active. And also it spreads through the whole muscle because these yellow tube-like things are like extensions of the sarcolemma that penetrate the whole muscle and then stimulate the calcium release on the SR, and that stimulates the muscle contraction because that's what frees up the active side or the magnet. Make sense? I know I'm starting to jimble my words, but it's good. Anybody question about that? Speak up if you do, because I don't just want to feel like we're getting it, Okay, muscle contraction is a ton of ATP. Most of that is resting state is produced in the mitochondria, which the muscle has a lot of it. However, if that is not enough, the muscle needs to be able to get energy from alternative sources. Remember, ATP becomes becoming ADP as it gives off the energy. You remember that? Mm-hmm. Good. in order to make the ADP back to an ATP molecule, the phosphate has to be reattached. Remember that? Good. Thankfully, there is a molecule in the muscle having one of those. It happily gives to the ADP. What is that molecule called? Creatine phosphate. Good. So let's go to that real quick. That's how the energy part, because muscle needs a lot of energy. When you're trying to run away from a lion, I mean, you know, and I think there is a little mistake in the book on there, is there? Looks a little weird. Did anybody notice anything? No? Good. Then it was just another place, and I messed up. I mistaked that for it. So when we look at the energy, most nicely done is when we get energy from ATP, from the mitochondria. We got a lot of energy from glucose. That's very nice if we use the food that way. The problem is sometimes we need more than we can make, and we need it fast. And so that's where we get the creatine phosphate energy from. And that's right here. And then the creatine phosphate, put the phosphate back from the CP takes the P over and puts it to the third P over here. That's basically what that's supposed to look like. So that's what that is. And then we also can do glycolysis, but glycolysis is when we break down glucose in the inside of the cell, not in the mitochondria, and we make 2 ATPs out of 1 glucose. But when we look over here, we get 36. So we want to make as much ATP we can coming from the mitochondria. We can have it when we need it coming from creatine phosphate, but glycolysis, when we have that level left, then we got to eat a lot of sugar to get that energy to get anything done. So that's not efficient at all. Very inefficient at that point. All right, so that's probably good enough for that. Let's see. There we go. Question 11. We got that. 12. How many we got? Some muscles are concerned with posture. They have to contract for long periods of time. Those muscles are also a little slower in contracting than the others. The faster ones are the others. They react quickly. When they are used to move us around. Their composition of muscles is slightly different depending on what activity is needed. A postural muscle has more oxygen storage because you need to contract longer but slower and not as forcefully. So we can get that energy from mitochondria nicely. So oxygen is needed in the mitochondria to make the ATP in the mitochondria. That's why we need the oxygen. So that's why oxygen, you always think oxygen when you think with ATP, and then you also think in this mitochondria, because you use that citric cycle, acid cycle to make the ATP. What was that question? A postural muscle example, more storage, sustained contraction. Oh, can you name that molecule? Myoglobin. So that's where you have that myo is muscle, and globin is the same from hemoglobin. But that myoglobin is more attracted to the oxygen than the hemoglobin, so when the blood flow goes by the muscle, the oxygen is nicely sucked out of the blood like that. And then the muscle has it available to, be able to make energy and run away from the lion. Good. If you lift something off the ground, your arm muscle contract to raise the weight. When a muscle shortens during the contraction, we call it being isotonic. What do we call it when the muscle length does not change? Isometric. So that isotonic is, so you do a curl. That's isotonic. The muscle, what it means, iso means the same. And tonic refers to the muscle. Tonus is almost like it's the same and you lift the same thing all the time. Although, what I better understand is the isometric. And that means you're lifting the grocery bag and you're carrying it home. You don't move it up and down to do more. You try to hold on to it. And so you try not to. And that's actually a thing. Don't lift like a grocery bags to the level where it's just all hanging on and you cannot contract the muscle. Try to use the muscles and don't ride on the joints. Yeah. I know, there's at some point in life when we start realizing that might be a good idea. So I went to somebody in a house call, and and she schlepped one of my table parts into the house. And then 2 weeks later, I said, dude, don't do that. She's like, I'm trained for that. That's what I trained for. But if you just slap it like that, I'm like, the arm's like trying to fall out. And then the other day when I worked on her again, she's like, oh, my arm hurt afterwards. Like, yeah, right. 3 days later. But that's, that when we're young, we can handle it. But when I work on a muscle on a 9-year-old, those muscles will talk about that brittle character. That's why, no, never mind, that characteristic. But, it gets harder. I mean, the muscles get dehydrated. That's why hydration is so important. Because the more we hydrate, the more all that fluidity stays in the tissues and the easier everything is, the more. But when you have an older muscle and you pull on it harder, then it's going to react differently than if it's younger. And so the groceries, that's for the groceries. Anyway, so that's the difference though between isotonic and isometric. And when we do the groceries, what stays the same is the length. The length is described in meter, not in feet. In America, you should call this isofetish, not isometric, isophytic. And I couldn't say that. But that makes sense, differential concepts. And then the isotonic, we can also then differentiate between shortening and lengthening. Shortening is concentric contraction, to shorten, and the lengthening is eccentric. When you do exercise, you want to not just do that's not going to do much. Well, it does some, but you just use the momentum, and again, you're riding on the joint and not on the muscle. You rather use not as heavy muscle, and you do the motion through the range of motion equally in speed. And the letting go is more important than the contraction we often talk about. And so when you rehab, yeah, you can use it for, too. My mom is 76, and she has the knee stuff, meniscus they found, and some arthritis and a little Baker cyst in the back, and so she found a program from Belgian physical therapists that is like rigorously training her. Like she has to walk up a stair like very slowly in total good posture until it hurts like crazy or something like that. Stuff like that. But not like, too fancy, but guided through 3 times a week or twice a week now after a few weeks, not too crazy, or even once a week now. She's hiking again, she says, like, hasn't before in a long time. So even at that age, you can rehab the stuff, and it's very interesting how fast it goes and how fast these muscles respond. But that's where, that's when we talk about these concepts too. And when I tell people to rehab, whatever you do or to work out, whatever you do, if you're having a fear with the machines or you don't know, do low weights and don't do full range of motion. Start in the middle range of motion, too slow. And that's safe. Yeah, don't go crazy on it. Don't feel like you're going to prove anything. Well, if you're doing it, break something, it's your own fault. Let's just go down. All right. We already talked about origin and social. Let's see what the next question is. Muscles come in many shapes and to accommodate the different forces put upon them. One of the interesting differences between the certain muscles is how the muscle fibers attach to a tendon. A tendon is the anchor that pulls the muscle fibers, the contractile elements, into the bone and sort of anchor it into the bone. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. That's the white stuff on the muscle. We'll describe the origin and the insertion. That's the white stuff that goes into the bone, and that's what, in the exercises, that's what I want you to label. Parallel arranged fibers are long with limited lifting strength. So think about that. You have a whole muscle length that one fiber is the whole length, and that whole thing contracts as one long fiber. It's okay, but it's a long cable. The other way we can do it, we can make it like where we have individual fibers attached to a tendon on an angle, and then the individual muscle fibers are shorter in that case. So you have a tendon that goes along the muscle, like the quad on top is like that, and the fibers come sideways into that tendon. The tendon is not just at the end of the muscle, it's the length of the muscle, or part of the length at least. And the fibers come in like when you take a feather from a bird. The little fibers come in sideways angrily, and the stem in the middle, you can think that's the tendon. So they actually call that muscle fiber, what do they call that muscle fiber? Pennant. That means feather from a bird, because it looks like that. And what you have in that instance is you have all these fibers next to one another. So you have tons of fibers that go in an angle, and when they pull, they yank all on that one tendon. That's much more force than if you got these long fibers, they just pull a little bit all together. Now, can you make sense of that? Make sense? It took me a long time to understand that concept, why like the quads, they need so much force exertion, or that kind of fiber type. And so in the facial, that don't need so much force, but need more fine tuning, or probably not a pennate muscle. They're probably more a parallel muscle fiber type. So anyway, food for thought. But let's see, what kind of picture did I find on that? There you go, that's a pretty good picture. Here we go, see, that's the tendon. Again, I should put up the picture and then talk about the picture. The tendon and the fibers coming from the side versus the fibers are long and just one next to the other. There's much less fibers out there. Oh, look at that last. When muscle contracts shorten, they rub against other tissues. This can create heat, which expands the tissue and makes it inflamed. We see that in carpal tunnel syndrome. What are some friction-reducing structures? That's the carpal tunnel one. And that's like bursitis. A lot of people get it like in the butt area. So another one that I notice as we get older, when standing a lot, we get the bursitis here in the butt area from standing a lot. So the synovial tendon sheet is like the blue stuff here. So everywhere we've got the blue stuff, you can think of like you've got a tendon, and then something around it is like a pillow that makes sure it cools it. It's like a cooling system. It's an AC system. And the cooling system makes sure this rubbing from the tendon, when it contracts, doesn't heat up from rubbing against other tendons. So that's kind of cool. The sheath is pretty cool the way it's done. Then we got bursate, and bursate, this is the greater trochanter in the femur. You can see that? No, wait a minute. What the heck? Yeah, that was the greater trochanter, but why is there another greater trochanter? I guess it's the other side. Well, anyway, here we got the greater trochanter, and then these purple things, baggies, are the bursa that go around over that. And they're in between the different muscles that are coming in later that we're going to talk about soon. They're like the glutes and all that stuff. And so that's a bursa, but that's pretty cool too. Oh, and this is really sweet. I like this picture, did you? You like this guy? It's very interesting because when you look at movement, see, one of the ways that we can look at muscles as we get into muscles is this fascia stuff. And the fascia stuff is the connections that anchor muscle tissue in the bone. Huh? Yeah, it looks like it's the cobweb stuff. Right. And it's many different ones. So the tendon structures are basically fascia. So you look at fascia as like the passive structures that translate the muscle, the red meat stuff, the active energy stuff into the bones to pull on then the bones to make stuff move. So that's one way that we look at it. And then yeah, in between the layers is the shiny stuff, the cobweb in between, that's fascia. So we have different levels and different types of fascia, but it's very important. It's not just like, it used to be like, oh, that's just the stuff you cut through because it's not active. But the way it translates, and we know what now we have so many nerve receptors in the fascia that brings a lot of feedback to the brain. So that's why hydration is again important. If that stuff is glued together, if you think you come in layers, and if you sleep and you're stiff in one position for a long time, those layers glued together when you don't move and stretch them out. That's why in the morning when you wake up, it's very important that you stretch out. You take some time to stretch out because you move these layers past one another. And so hydration is also important for that. But one of the things that I also like is the fact that, see these lines here? I should have put the back line on. But there is a line in the back that goes from the front of the head actually down up here to the occiput, and then down the whole back, all the way in the back down in the butt, and then in here, all the way down to the sole of the foot. And it's like one, some people consider that like one muscle family or group or line, they call it an anatomy train. There's another term that they use, anatomy train. And you have everywhere along the line, you have attachments of that fascia to the bone. And then in between, you have muscle tissue that's in between that fascia. That's the contractile stuff. And so when you look at movement, for example, with that back line, you can see when when you walk, you move and you bend your knee, then you lift your butt, and then you lift your back a little bit. That's all I consider one muscle chain. And so if we then look at muscle, it's a very interesting way to look at it. If you look at an injury, it's like, well, what did you do? What happened? Where along the chain could what have happened? Or if I look at it, for example, I say like, well, the sole of the foot is attached to the neck up here. So if somebody has neck pain and I don't look at the foot to see if the foot is flat, and that tenses everything and it pulls on everything a little bit, and now we have neck pain because all along the way we have some issues, and I want to look at all the different issues that I can find to resolve to make this problem up here get better. That's when I look at that too. But it's interesting to understand, because when you go, depending on the anatomy class you take, you just get a list of muscles and you just got to go down the list. And we got to do that too. But at the same time, you also want to look at the bigger picture. This stuff, they started coming up in 2007. This is all brand new stuff. I mean, they had it a long time come up, but they started paying attention again. The first Congress of Fascia was at Harvard in 2007. So that's why I always talk a little bit about it, just to get the bigger picture in there. And we segue to muscles now anyway. And then sesamoid bone, I already discussed the sesamoid bone when we talked about the knee. Remember that? The sesamoid bone embedded in the tendon, they help with making muscle movement smooth and continuous. So when a muscle contracts, the same force of contraction doesn't make different movements depending on where along the line you are in the movement pattern. So if you don't have a patella, you're going to have a lot of muscle contraction before that knee moves, and once it moves, it jerks up, because the tendon will be more in an angle, in a right angle, than it is in a rounded position. So that's the sesamoid bone. So that's also sort of an ancillary helper in the system. All right, so with that, I think that was the last question, right? Good. So, I'm going to now have us do a quiz.